The first thing Clara heard was the ticking of her kitchen clock. It was loud that evening, louder than it had ever been before. The kind of ticking that crawls under your skin and settles there, counting down to something you don't yet understand. Her phone rang at 9:17 p.m. She almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved, but the area code was familiar, Tennessee. Her stomach clenched before her mind caught up. She answered on the fourth ring. "Clara?" The voice was breathless, whispering. "Mrs. Hale? It's me. I need you to listen carefully. Don't ask questions yet. You need to leave your apartment. Right now." The world shifted slightly on its axis. What? "Evan was here," Margaret Hale said, voice trembling. "He left 15 minutes ago. He's driving to you." Clara's pulse began to throb in her ears. "He had a gasket in the truck." And he said, Margaret stopped. Clara could hear her inhale sharply. He said some things only end when they're burned clean. The ticking clock seemed to stop. "You need to leave," Margaret whispered. "Not hide, not turn off the lights. Get in your car and go somewhere he would never think to look." The call ended with Margaret repeating one thing over and over. "I should have told you sooner." Clara didn't pack. She grabbed her keys from the bowl by the door, her wallet, her phone charger. That was it. Her apartment in Tulsa had always smelled faintly of vanilla candles and old hardwood, comfort layered over age. It had taken her months to make it feel like hers after the divorce. Throw pillows and muted sage. A woven rug she'd saved for. Plants on the windowsill that leaned toward the sun. She didn't look back at any of it. The night air hit her like cold water. She slid into her car, locked the doors, and pulled out without checking the mirror twice. Her hand shook so badly she missed the turn toward the highway and had to circle back. She called her father. "Dad," she said, and that was all she managed before her voice broke. "Slow down," he said instantly, steady as stone. "Tell me where you are." But to understand why a single phone call could shatter her sense of safety so completely, you have to understand Evan Hale. And to understand Evan, you have to understand the way charm can feel like oxygen. Clara had met Evan at 24. He was magnetic in the way some people are, not loud, not flashy, controlled, intentional. He made eye contact that felt like warmth. He remembered details. He showed up at her office with lunch once because she'd mentioned she'd skipped breakfast. "I just didn't like the idea of you being hungry," he'd said with a half smile. She mistook attentiveness for devotion. They married in under 2 years. His hometown was nestled in rural Tennessee, 2 hours from Nashville. Rolling hills, rusted fences, family land stretching back generations. His father had died when Evan was 13. Margaret had raised him and his younger sister, Lillian, alone in a white farmhouse with creaking floors and wide porches. Margaret had welcomed Clara with open arms. "Your sunshine," she told her once, squeezing her hands. "He needs that." Clara hadn't realized then that Margaret wasn't speaking lightly. The first crack had been quiet. Evan's silences were weapons. If Clara said the wrong thing, laughed too loudly at someone else's joke, forgot to text back immediately, chose dinner without asking him first, he would withdraw, not yelling, not screaming, just cold absence. He'd go hours without speaking, sometimes a day. "If you love me," he'd say eventually, voice measured, "you wouldn't need to ask what you did." Clara learned to scan the room for invisible tripwires. She began apologizing for things she couldn't name. The isolation was slow, strategic. Friends became negative influences. Family visits became disrespectful to our marriage. He handled finances, gave her an allowance. "You're not good with money," he'd say, kissing her temple. "Let me take care of that." The first time he grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise, it was over misplaced receipt. The bruises bloomed purple and yellow against her skin. The next morning, he made her coffee exactly the way she liked it. "You know I'd never hurt you," he said softly. "You just push me sometimes." She believed him, because believing him was easier than believing she had married a stranger. Back in Tulsa, her tires hummed against the asphalt as Clara drove toward the police station. Her father had insisted. Public place. Cameras. Don't argue. She sat in her car under the harsh fluorescent lights of the station parking lot. watching every truck that entered. Every pair of headlights made her throat tighten. She thought about the farmhouse porch in Tennessee, about Margaret's lined face when she'd once seen bruises under Clara's sleeve. Margaret hadn't said much that day. Just, "My door is always open." Clara hadn't walked through it then. She had walked out months later, after Evan threw a glass that shattered inches from her head. He hadn't flinched, just watched the shards fall. That was the moment she realized something fundamental. He wasn't losing control. He enjoyed the power of almost. The police told her Evan had checked into a motel outside Oklahoma City. He hadn't broken any laws yet. Yet, he wasn't near her apartment. He wasn't near her. He was simply existing in the same state. That night, she didn't sleep. Fear as a scent. It smells metallic, like blood in the air. The next morning, Margaret called again. "He came back," she said, like nothing happened. Clara pressed her fingers into her forehead. "What did he say?" "That you're confused. That you'll come home when you calm down." Home. The word felt like poison. "He's talking about you like you're misplaced property," Margaret whispered. "Not a person." Clara's stomach dropped. "He asked about your parents," Margaret added. The ticking clock started again. This was not a story about a single threat. It was a story about escalation, about a man who believed love meant ownership, and about the thin, fragile space between intention and action. Clara didn't yet know how close that space would become, but she was about to find out. Clara's drive through the winding back roads of Oklahoma felt like moving through a dream she couldn't wake from. The moon was hidden behind clouds, leaving only a pale wash of light to illuminate the trees that leaned over the asphalt like watchful sentinels. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig in the distance made her startle, her hands tightening on the steering wheel as if the car itself could protect her. She hadn't realized how much the sound of her own breathing could feel intrusive, how each exhale reminded her of the fragility of her situation. The city lights were gone, swallowed by darkness, and she felt the weight of isolation pressing down as heavily as Evan's earlier silences had. She remembered the farmhouse in Tennessee, the way the porch light would glow softly at night, casting long shadows on the wooden planks. Margaret had always said that porch was a safe place, a boundary where love and care existed. Now that memory was a lifeline, but it also reminded her how far away that sanctuary was, and how tenuous her current safety felt. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her pocket. Text messages, missed calls, notifications that she could barely look at without her heart skipping. Margaret sent a single line that read, "I've arranged for someone to meet you at the diner outside Norman. You have to trust me." Clara had never been so dependent on someone else's planning before, but desperation makes people surrender control. She took the next exit with trembling hand and navigated toward the small roadside diner that flickered in neon orange against the inky black of the surrounding fields. The smell of fried grease and coffee greeted her as she pushed the door open. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, save for the night shift cook and a lone trucker in the corner. It smelled of old leather and strong coffee, of stale pies kept under glass domes, the kind of smell that evokes normalcy, a life untouched by fear. Clara felt the anxiety ease slightly in the mundane environment, but it was only temporary. A man approached her table, tall, unassuming, with tired eyes that carried quiet authority. "Clara?" he asked softly, without moving too close. His voice was calm, precise, and it carried the weight of someone who had seen enough danger to recognize immediately. She nodded, and he slid into the booth opposite her, without waiting for invitation. "You need to understand the timeline," he said. "Evan's pattern isn't random. He escalates in predictable stages. First, the subtle psychological control, then the physical threats, then the manipulations that make the victim question reality. He's at stage 2 now, and he's moving fast." Clara's stomach dropped. She knew what stage 1 had looked like. Bruises, silences, subtle warnings. But stage 2? She shivered at the thought, her mind racing through the incidents she had tried to dismiss, the moments of sharp tension she had chalked up to stress. She realized she had been reading his behaviors backward, misinterpreting threats as quirks, until every piece fit together in a puzzle too horrifying to consider. The man, who introduced himself as Daniel, a former investigator with ties to Margaret, explained that Evan had been preparing for this moment for months, studying Clara's routines, knowing her friends' schedules, even predicting her flight paths. Every choice she thought was spontaneous had been anticipated. The realization made her blood run cold, and she felt the creeping terror being trapped in a web spun by someone who knew her better than she knew herself. Daniel suggested a temporary relocation, a hidden safe house several towns over where Clara could regroup and plan her next moves. But getting there would be the challenge. Evan's mind worked like a chess master's, predicting reactions, forcing traps, making a simple drive feel like navigating a minefield. As they left the diner, Daniel drove, and Clara sat in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning every reflective surface, every shadow that could hide movement. She remembered her apartment, the cozy warmth of her now-abandoned home, the smell of vanilla and sunlight on the hardwood floors, and the sudden emptiness of losing that space. A car passed them on the opposite lane, headlights briefly catching her in the rearview mirror. Her pulse jumped, and she noticed Daniel's hand twitch, instinctively toward the glove compartment. "That could be him," he said softly. "Or it could be nothing. The point is, you have to prepare for both." Clara realized in that moment how high the stakes were. This wasn't just about leaving a house. It was about survival, about outthinking someone who had once been her husband, someone who had known her fears before she even acknowledged them herself. The journey to the safe house was filled with silence broken only by occasional whispered instructions from Daniel. They passed abandoned gas stations, cracked asphalt roads lined with tall, whispering cornfields, and small towns that seemed frozen in time. Each place had a story embedded in its walls, in the peeling paint, in the neon signs buzzing faintly with electricity. Clara imagined Evan driving along similar roads, mapping each curve, planning where he might catch up. Her mind kept replaying his smile, the way he could make calm look like devotion, control look like love. She understood now that that was a danger. He had conditioned her to confuse fear with affection, intimidation with care. The complexity of it gnawed at her resolve. By the time they reached the safe house, Clara's body was exhausted, but her mind raced. The small cabin was tucked deep in a wooded area, the kind of place where the wind whistled through pine trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and needles. Inside, the air smelled of pine cleaner and old fabric. The rooms were sparse but functional, furnished with the essentials, a makeshift kitchen, and a single bedroom with heavy curtains that blocked out light and prying eyes. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a flicker of control. She unpacked slowly, deliberately, placing her few belongings in drawers, grounding herself in the physical act of reclaiming space. Yet the fear lingered, a shadow in the corners, a constant whisper that she could not ignore. Later that evening, she sat by the window, watching the wind move through the trees. Daniel had gone to make calls, to ensure the perimeter was secure, to check if Evan had traced her route. Clara's mind wandered back to Margaret, to Evan's childhood home, and to the countless moments she had allowed herself to be blinded by charm. She realized that the past had shaped this moment. The fragile psychology of a man molded by loss, isolation, and control intersected with a woman conditioned to please, to adapt, to survive within someone else's narrative. She understood that surviving would not just be physical. It would require unraveling every manipulation, every memory, and every instinct she had been forced to ignore. A sudden crackling in the underbrush outside startled her. She froze, listening as the sound repeated. Irregular, almost deliberate. Her stomach churned. The reality of Evan's reach felt immediate, like a tightening around her chest. Daniel returned, shutting the door gently behind him. "You'll need to sleep," he said, though his eyes were wary. Clara nodded, knowing that every moment of rest could be a vulnerability, but exhaustion had claimed her anyway. She lay on the thin mattress, listening to the forest breathe, the ticking clock of her own heart louder than any timepiece. Sleep came reluctantly, fragmented, punctuated by dreams where Evan's voice whispered in corners, and she woke screaming, only to remember she was still alive, still hiding, still fighting. By dawn, Clara's resolve had hardened. She would not just survive. She would plan, learn, and outmaneuver the man who had once promised her love and almost claimed her life. She began making notes, mapping his known habits, remembering every subtle threat, every past manipulation. The game had changed. The rules had become clear. And for the first time, She felt the faintest spark of hope that she might emerge in the shadows, not as a victim, but as someone who understood the darkness well enough to navigate it. And yet, outside the cabin, the world remained indifferent. The wind rustled, the trees whispered, and somewhere, miles away, a man with practiced calm was beginning to realize that Clara was no longer a predictable piece on his board. The days that followed were a blur of careful routines and restless vigilance. Clara had begun to move like a shadow herself, silent in the small cabin, watching, listening, cataloging every possible weakness in her environment. Daniel had taught her to notice the subtle signs: a branch bent the wrong way, footprints in damp soil, the faintest echo of a car engine miles away. Each sound and motion became a code she was learning to decipher. The forest, once a source of eerie loneliness, had transformed into an ally. The scent of pine and wet earth was no longer merely comforting. It was a signal, a guide to the invisible border she was tracing, invisible lines she hoped would keep her one step ahead of Evan. But as Clara settled into this new rhythm, her mind could not escape the persistent memory of Evan's presence, his smile, his precise movements, the way he seemed to anticipate her thoughts before they formed. Late one evening, Daniel returned from scouting the surrounding roads with a grave expression. He placed a small laptop on the kitchen table and gestured for Clara to sit. On the screen were surveillance images from traffic cameras, some from hours ago, some more recent. "He's trying to locate you," Daniel said, his voice low, careful not to carry beyond the walls. Clara leaned closer, recognizing a familiar car weaving along the highways, always just a few minutes behind her own route. The realization was suffocating. Evan wasn't chasing blindly. He was studying, predicting, learning from every deviation she made. Fear clawed at her chest, but now there was something else, an ember of defiance. She could see him, he could see her, and the next moves would be decisive. Clara began compiling notes on every road, every gas station, every likely stop along the highways. Her notebook was soon filled with maps, timelines, and contingency plans. Each annotation was an act of reclaiming agency she had never realized she had lost. The psychological strain was immense. At night, Clara would lie awake, listening to the wind whip against the cabin, hearing phantom footsteps that she knew were merely echoes of her own anxiety. Memories of her life with Evan haunted her. The early days when his charm had seemed boundless, the gentle words that masked manipulation, the controlling behavior she had brushed aside as quirks or misunderstandings. She remembered her first hesitation, the small lies he'd woven to isolate her from friends and family, and now she understood the cumulative power of those moments. Each small control had been a thread that could have unraveled her life entirely had she not recognized it in time. The realization left a bitter taste in her mouth, an anger simmering beneath her exhaustion, fueling her determination to turn the tables. Clara also began to explore her emotional responses in depth. She forced herself to recall her feelings of guilt, fear, and compliance, confronting them one by one. Writing them down became a ritual. She confronted the part of herself that had always wanted approval, the part that had excused his controlling behavior out of love, and the part that had doubted her own instincts. She wrote letters she would never send, poured out the traumas and manipulations onto paper, transforming helplessness into analysis, fear into strategy. By naming her emotions, she reduced her power over her, turning vulnerability into insight. Every page of writing was a step toward reclaiming herself. It wasn't long before the first confrontation of intellect took place. Clara and Daniel had been planning a brief trip into town to acquire supplies, and Daniel insisted on a detour that tested both of them. Clara's eyes constantly flicked to the road behind them, alert to any irregularities. When a black SUV appeared in a distant curve, moving slightly too slowly, she froze. Daniel's hand brushed hers. "He's learning," he whispered. Clara's mind raced. Could they mislead him? Could they use the roads and the traffic to create a false trail? She realized that survival was no longer reactive. It had to be proactive, anticipatory. Every turn, every lane change, every traffic signal became a piece of the puzzle. And yet, with each calculated move, the adrenaline left her body trembling, her pulse pounding in sync with the ticking clock of her life. The cabin itself had become a laboratory of resilience. Clara tested every window, reinforced every door, and placed small motion sensors along invisible perimeters. She memorized escape routes in case of immediate intrusion, even imagining multiple contingencies if Evan discovered their location. The cabin's air, once filled with a quiet scent of pine, now carried the subtle metallic tang of tension. Each corner, each shadow, each rustle of leaves outside reminded Clara of the stakes. She could no longer afford comfort. Every sense was sharpened to survival, every nerve alert to the possibility of detection. Yet amidst this, she discovered an unexpected clarity. The constant awareness honed her instincts, made her see patterns she would have otherwise ignored, and began to illuminate the psychological strategies Evan had relied on for years. Meanwhile, Daniel worked to gather intelligence on Evan. They discovered that he had an intricate network of informants, people who were either loyal to him or had been manipulated into compliance. His past revealed a pattern of relationships fractured by control and fear. Clara absorbed every detail, understanding how his upbringing, abandoned emotionally at key moments, trained to anticipate threats, forced to manipulate to maintain relevance, had shaped the man she had married. She began to separate the image she had of Evan as a loving husband from the man he truly was, understanding that her fear was not merely personal. It was a result of a lifetime of calculated behaviors. But the psychological intensity escalated further when Clara noticed subtle messages left in digital spaces. Emails with innocuous subject lines, browser cookies tracking her movement. Even subtle changes in the public GPS traffic patterns suggested surveillance. Each discovery sent a jolt through her system, yet each also reinforced the necessity of strategy. Clara began to adopt Evan's own meticulousness, monitoring his likely actions, creating countermeasures, testing what information could be controlled and what could be manipulated. It was exhausting work, mentally and emotionally, but with every small victory, she reclaimed a piece of her autonomy. As the nights grew longer, the tension sharpened into a blade. Clara often woke to the feeling of being watched, even when the forest around her remained silent. Shadows seemed to take on life, shapes bending at the edges of her vision, and every sound, a snapping branch, a distant howl, a bird taking flight, carried potential significance. Yet, paradoxically, these moments of fear honed her resolve. Clara understood that survival demanded more than vigilance. It demanded courage, strategy, and the ability to remain calm when every instinct screamed panic. She realized that she was no longer running blindly. She was studying, anticipating, and planning. Each day sharpened her mind and body, forging a version of herself that Evan had never accounted for, one capable of outthinking and outmaneuvering him. The turning point came unexpectedly. One evening, while reviewing surveillance images, Clara noticed a subtle anomaly in Evan's movements, a pattern that suggested overconfidence, a rare misstep, a flaw in the careful choreography he had relied upon. Her pulse quickened. Daniel noticed her intensity. "You see it?" he asked. Clara nodded, tracing the path on a map, identifying a potential opportunity to mislead him entirely. It was risky, perhaps the riskiest move yet, but the knowledge that she could exploit his arrogance brought a surge of adrenaline and determination. For the first time, Clara felt that control could slip from his hands, that the hunter could become the hunted. And as the moon rose over the forest, casting long silver streaks through the pine, Clara made a silent vow. She would survive. She would reclaim her life. And when the time came, Evan would understand that fear, once his weapon, had become the very tool he had underestimated. Clara's pulse had become the rhythm of a life lived on the razor's edge. Every sunrise brought the weight of careful calculation. Every sunset the exhaustion of perpetual vigilance. The forest around the cabin had shifted in her mind from a place of refuge to a stage for strategy, its dense thickets and hidden clearings now elements of the game whose rules were written in fear and cunning. She moved with the precision of a predator, her eyes scanning tree lines, the underbrush and distant trails, memorizing patterns of shadows and light that could betray her presence or conceal it. Daniel observed her transformation silently, noting the mixture of fear, resilience, and growing confidence that Clara exhibited. Where once she had recoiled from even the faintest crack of a branch, now she approached it with the same analytical attention she might give a chessboard, interpreting each sound as a potential clue in the intricate web of pursuit and deception. The psychological toll intensified when subtle threats began infiltrating her dreams. Clara would awaken, heart racing, to visions of Evan appearing at impossible angles, of the shadows of strangers bending toward her, of voices whispering her name with an uncanny precision. Her subconscious had become a battlefield, a reflection of the external threats she faced daily. Yet these nights also strengthened her resolve. Waking from nightmares became a ritual of affirmation, a reminder that she must separate perception from reality while still trusting instincts honed by fear and necessity. Every day she cataloged anomalies. Every night she rehearsed responses. It was exhaustion taken to a level where mental sharpness and survival instincts became inseparable. One afternoon, Clara received an encrypted email that made her blood run cold. The message contained images of her cabin from angles that no public road or known trail could provide. Evan had found a way to bypass even the most careful measures she had taken. The hairs on her arms rose as she traced the metadata. He was closer than ever. Daniel entered the room, sensing the tension immediately. "We knew this day would come," he said quietly. Clara's hand shook, but not with fear alone. The knowledge sparked the strategic mind she had cultivated, the realization that vulnerability could be weaponized. She meticulously examined the email, tracing the IP, plotting possible approaches, and determining how best to lure Evan into a trap without risking exposure. It was a delicate dance, a psychological duel where the slightest miscalculation could be catastrophic. The next step involved mobility. Clara and Daniel prepared a series of decoy movements, designed to mislead Evan into believing she had left the forest entirely. She packed only essentials, leaving a carefully staged trail of belongings that hinted at haste. The cabin itself became a ruse, filled with misleading signs of occupancy, a recently lit fireplace, discarded cups, a book left open as though she had been reading moments before vanishing. Clara's pulse quickened with the exhilaration and control, the intoxicating sense that she could manipulate the hunter by understanding his own reliance on observation and overconfidence. It was a reversal of roles she had long imagined but now executed with precision, turning fear into empowerment. The forest offered both advantage and peril. Thick fog rolled in as they moved on the cover of night, muffling footsteps and obscuring sightlines, yet amplifying the risk of missteps. Clara's senses were alert to every sound: the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs under distant feet, the faint engine hum of vehicles hidden by the terrain. Every move was deliberate, every pause a calculation. She had become acutely aware of her physicality, the way her body interacted with the environment, the need to balance speed with silence, survival with strategy. Daniel followed her closely, sharing in the tension but relying on her leadership in the critical moments, acknowledging that Clara had transformed from a victim into the orchestrator of the game. By the fourth night, Clara's plan entered its most dangerous phase. She identified a narrow canyon that funneled movement predictably, with rocky outcroppings ideal for observation. Here, she could control sight lines, leaving Evan vulnerable to misdirection while keeping herself partially concealed. The air was thick with moisture, carrying a faint smell of damp stone and pine resin, and every breath reminded Clara of the stakes. Her mind raced with contingencies. What if he anticipated the trap? What if he approached from an unforeseen direction? Each scenario was rehearsed silently, her imagination doubling as both weapon and shield. She placed small markers and sensors along the path, each designed to provide early warning or mislead, a system of defense that relied on cunning rather than brute strength. The psychological warfare escalated further when Evan finally made contact. His figure emerged on the canyon rim, eyes scanning the terrain, movements deliberate and cautious. Clara's heart pounded, but her body remained composed, her muscles coiled like springs ready to act. Every instinct Daniel had taught her now merged with years of self-awareness and strategy. Evan's confidence radiated, the arrogance of man used control. Yet it betrayed him in small ways, slight hesitations, a subtle shift in gaze, a misjudgment in timing. Clara recognized these cues immediately. This was a vulnerability she had prepared for, the one crack in an otherwise formidable facade. She knew that one precise action could tip the balance, turning the hunter into prey, rewriting the rules of pursuit entirely. The confrontation itself was brief but intense, a dance of anticipation and manipulation. Clara allowed Evan to approach partially, guiding him into the canyon's natural trap with subtle cues. Displaced rocks, faint footprints leading in circles, the illusion of an escape route where none existed. When he reached the critical point, she triggered a small alert that set off an acoustic signal designed to startle and disorient. Evan froze, instinctively scanning for the source, his composure faltering for the first time. Clara's eyes met his, and in that split second, she understood the true power of preparation, patience, and psychological insight. It was not brute force that gave her control. It was knowledge, strategy, and the ability to predict the thoughts of a man who believed himself always in command. After the encounter, silence settled over the canyon like a shroud. Clara's breathing slowed, yet adrenaline lingered, making every sound in the forest sharp, immediate. Daniel joined her, a mixture of pride and tension on his face. "You did it," he said softly. Clara allowed herself a brief, private acknowledgement of victory, aware that this was only a step in a much longer journey. Evan had been outmaneuvered, but he had not yet been neutralized. The stakes had risen, the danger now unmistakably tangible, yet Clara's resolve had never been clearer. She understood, more deeply than ever, that survival was more than endurance. It was master over fear, clarity of thought, and the ability to transform every obstacle into a strategic advantage. As night fell, and the first stars appeared above the canyon rim, Clara allowed herself a moment of reflection. The forest, once alien and menacing, now felt like an extension of her awareness, a landscape of possibilities shaped by observation and cunning. She thought of the woman she had been, the life she had lost, and the independence she had reclaimed. Every challenge, every threat, every night of fear had forged a sharper, more resilient version of herself. And while the path ahead remained fraught with danger, she was no longer running blindly. Clara had become both strategist and sentinel, understanding that the greatest power lay not in avoidance, but in preparation, insight, and the courage to act decisively when the moment demanded it. The forest had grown silent, almost reverent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath for what was about to unfold. Clara felt the weight of every choice she had made, the consequence of every calculated risk, pressing against her chest. She moved through the underbrush with a confidence that now bordered on instinct, every step purposeful, every glance scanning for anomalies. Daniel stayed close, his presence a grounding force amid the tension that thrummed like electricity in the air. They had anticipated Evan's retaliation, knew he would strike with renewed desperation after being outmaneuvered in the canyon. Yet, for the first time in months, Clara no longer felt the icy grip of fear alone. She carried with her the clarity of experience, a sharpened mind that transformed terror into strategy, anxiety into awareness. Evan's approach was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A rustle behind the oaks, a shadow moving against the moonlight. Clara didn't flinch. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, visualized it, predicted it. As he emerged into a small clearing, the dim light revealing his tense expression, she recognized a man she had once feared, now stripped of his invincibility. His eyes darted, seeking control, but every movement betrayed hesitation, the instinctual realization that he had underestimated her. Clara stepped forward, the damp forest floor muffling her footsteps, yet each movement radiating authority and calculated precision. Her voice, calm and unwavering, carried over the stillness. This Ensign, Evan. It was not a threat. It was a declaration of mastery over the fear that had once dictated her every action. The confrontation escalated in a tense ballet of psychological warfare. Evan lunged, seeking to intimidate, but Clara's preparedness nullified his aggression. She guided him through the clearing with subtle maneuvers, exploiting the terrain's natural constraints and the traps she had set earlier. Panic flickered across his face as he realized the canyon's strategic advantage had shifted irrevocably. For the first time, he was reacting, not controlling. Every misstep amplified the peril he had ignored for so long. Clara's heart raced, but her mind was crystalline, analyzing his reactions in real time, anticipating his next move, and guiding him toward the inevitable consequence of his own recklessness. Daniel watched silently, ready to intervene, yet aware that Clara alone now held the power to determine the outcome. Hours passed in a tense equilibrium of pursuit and misdirection, until the moment of reckoning arrived. Clara led Evan to a final clearing, a natural enclosure where the forest canopy dimmed the light, creating a sense of confinement without physical restraint. The trap she had prepared, a combination of visual cues, subtle alarms, and environmental obstacles, ensnared him, forcing him to confront the consequences of his choices. Clara's voice broke the silence again, steady but resolute. You thought you could control everything. You were wrong. Your actions have consequences. For the first time, Evan could not manipulate, could not deceive, could not escape. He stood exposed, confronted by a woman who had endured, adapted, and mastered the very fears he had sought to impose upon her. The psychological confrontation proved as powerful as any physical struggle. Evan's composure crumbled under the weight of his own realization. He saw, perhaps for the first time, the depth of Clara's transformation. Not merely surviving, but thriving under pressure, harnessing fear and uncertainty as tools rather than weaknesses. His attempt at intimidation faltered, replaced by desperate reasoning, pleading, and finally, silent acknowledgement. Clara absorbed the moment fully, recognizing that victory was not derived from vengeance, but from understanding, preparation, and unwavering resolve. The forest, which had once seemed a place of danger, now felt like a witness to the reclamation of power and autonomy. Afterward, the tension dissipated slowly, replaced by a fragile but profound sense of closure. Clara allowed herself a moment to breathe, the night air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the stars above shimmering with a quiet serenity. Daniel approached, offering a hand and a nod of respect. She realized that the months of fear, strategy, and constant vigilance had forged not only a plan, but a new identity, one of resilience, clarity, and empowerment. Clara had emerged transformed, no longer merely reactive, but proactive, capable, and unshakable in the face of adversity. In the weeks that followed, Clara reclaimed her life with deliberate intent. The forest remained, a place of reflection rather than fear. Each path she traversed a reminder of the trials she had endured and the growth she had achieved. Evan's threat was neutralized, yet the lessons of vigilance, preparedness, and self-trust lingered, imprinted on her psyche like a permanent compass for navigating future challenges. Clara's journey concluded not with triumph over another person, but with triumph over doubt, fear, and limitation. Every sound, every shadow, every breath now carried the resonance of hard-won wisdom. By the time spring arrived, the forest had transformed along with her, vibrant with renewal and growth. Clara walked the trails with a sense of peace that had once seemed unattainable, aware of the strength she had cultivated, the independence she had earned, and the depth of her own resilience. The journey had been harrowing, the stakes life-altering, but the transformation was undeniable. She had endured the edge of danger, faced it with courage and cunning, and emerged not only unbroken but profoundly empowered. Her story, etched into the landscape of both mind and forest, would remain as a testament to capacity for human perseverance, strategy, and the indomitable will to survive and flourish, no matter the odds.